On the morning of March 19th, 2026, the world received news it struggled to believe. Chuck Norris was gone, not because people thought he was immortal in a literal sense, but because some figures become so deeply embedded in culture, in memory, in myth, that their ending feels impossible. Just 9 days earlier, at 86 years old, he was still training, still moving, still sparring with the same discipline that defined his entire life. And then, suddenly, he was gone. The man who turned toughness into a global symbol, the man who became a meme, a myth, and a legend all at once, had finally met the one opponent no training, no strength, and no roundhouse kick could stop: death. But to understand how the world reached this moment, you have to go back to where the legend actually began. Before the world knew him as a symbol of strength, before the memes, before the action films that defined an entire generation, there was only a man. Carlos Ray Norris was not born into greatness. He was not shaped by privilege, fame, or opportunity. In fact, his early life carried none of the signs that would ever point toward global recognition. What the world later turned into jokes about unstoppable strength started as something far more quiet, almost invisible. Because Chuck Norris didn't begin as a legend. He began as a boy who felt unseen. And yet, over time, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through years of discipline, failure, and repetition that most people never see. The internet would later turn him into an impossible figure, someone who could defeat anything or never lose. But the truth behind the myth is far more interesting, because the real story is not about someone who was born powerful. It is about someone who built himself from nothing but structure, pain, and relentless focus until the world could no longer tell the difference between the man and the myth. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. To understand how a quiet boy from Oklahoma became one of the most recognized names in the world, we have to go back to the beginning of everything. In a small town called Ryan, Oklahoma, there were no spotlights, no cameras, and no signs that the world was about to produce a future icon. Only silence. Carlos Ray Norris was born into a home that carried more struggle than stability. His father, a World War II veteran, battled with alcohol and instability, drifting between jobs and absences that left the family constantly under pressure. There was love there, but it was buried under chaos. And for a child, that kind of environment does something deeper than hardship. It creates invisibility. Chuck Norris wasn't loud. He wasn't confident. He wasn't the kind of child who stood out in a room. In fact, by his own later reflection, he often felt like he simply existed on the edges of everything, watching life happen rather than living it fully. But what the world didn't see was what was forming inside that silence. Because in the absence of stability, something else grows. Endurance. His mother, Wilma, became the anchor of the family. Strong, disciplined, and deeply faithful, she carried the emotional weight that held everything from falling apart completely. She didn't have luxury or ease, only responsibility and resilience. When the family eventually broke apart through divorce, everything shifted again. New places, new environments, new uncertainty. And yet, through all of it, young Carlos remained the same on the surface, quiet, reserved, almost unnoticed. But beneath that quiet exterior, something was building. A mindset shaped not by success, but by survival. And it was this version of him, the unseen version, the underestimated version, that would later become the foundation of everything the world would recognize as Chuck Norris. Because before the strength, there was only silence. And before the legend, there was a boy who no one was watching. At 18, Chuck Norris made a decision that would quietly change the direction of his entire life. He enlisted in the United States Air Force, not as a declaration of ambition, but as a search for structure, for direction, for something that could give shape to a life that, until then, had felt uncertain and unformed. He was stationed far from home, at Osan Air Base in South Korea, a place that for most young men would have been just another assignment. But for him, it became something else entirely. It was here that the name Chuck first appeared, a simple nickname given by fellow airmen, but one that would eventually replace Carlos Rain Norris in history. More importantly, it was here that he encountered something that would define the rest of his existence. Martial arts. Tang Soo Do was not just a physical discipline. It was structure, philosophy, control, and identity all wrapped into one system. For a young man who had grown up around instability, it offered something he had never truly experienced before order. And he embraced it completely. Training did not become a hobby. It became obsession, repetition, focus, discipline without distraction. Hour after hour, day after day, he built himself through movement and control, discovering a version of himself that had never existed before. By the time he left the Air Force, he was no longer the quiet, uncertain boy from Oklahoma. He was someone else entirely. Not yet a legend, but no longer ordinary. Because sometimes the most important transformations do not happen in moments of victory. They happen in silence, in discipline, and in places far away from the world that will one day be watching. When Chuck Norris returned to California, there was no fame waiting for him. No shortcuts, no industry connections, no guarantees that anything he had learned overseas would matter in the world he had come back to. He opened a small martial arts studio in Torrance and began building from the ground up, step by step, student by student, fight by fight. At first, the results were not what most people would call extraordinary. He lost matches. He was tested by fighters who were faster, sharper, more experienced in competition than he was. But what separated him from others was not immediate success. It was response to failure. Because Chuck Norris did not treat defeat as identity. He treated it as information. He studied it, adjusted, rebuilt, returned stronger. And over time, something began to shift. The same man who once struggled in competitive circuits started to dominate them. Not through luck, but through repetition, discipline, and an almost obsessive commitment to improvement. By the late 1960s, he was no longer just competing, he was winning consistently. And by the time he reached the peak of his martial arts career, he had achieved something few fighters ever accomplish. He became a world middleweight karate champion, holding the title for years without defeat. But perhaps more importantly, something else was happening outside the competition floor. His studio was attracting attention, not from ordinary students alone, but from names the world already recognized. Steve McQueen, Priscilla Presley, Bob Barker, people who didn't just come to learn technique, but came to understand why this man carried himself with such control and presence. Because by this point, Chuck Norris was no longer just a martial artist. He was becoming something far rarer, a standard, a quiet example of what happens when discipline is repeated long enough that it becomes identity. And without realizing it yet, the world of entertainment had already started watching. By the early 1970s, something unusual was happening. Chuck Norris was no longer just a competitor in martial arts circles. He was becoming a name people respected beyond the tournament floor. And then came the moment that would quietly lock him into film history forever. Bruce Lee. At the time, Bruce Lee was already becoming a force of nature in cinema, a man redefining what martial arts looked like on screen. But what most people don't realize is that behind the camera, Bruce was also searching for something rare. Real fighters, real presence, real control. And in Chuck Norris, he found exactly that. Their connection wasn't built on rivalry. It was built on mutual recognition. Two men who understood the same language without needing to explain it. They trained together, sparred together, pushed each other with a level of intensity that only true martial artists understand. Then came The Way of the Dragon, a film that would later become iconic, not because of special effects or storytelling, but because of one final fight scene inside a Roman Colosseum. Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris. No stunt doubles that mattered. No artificial exaggeration. Just movement, timing, discipline, and absolute physical control. On screen, Chuck Norris lost that fight. But in reality, something else was happening. Because that moment introduced him to Hollywood in a way nothing else could. Not as an actor, but as someone real enough that the camera didn't need to pretend. After that moment with Bruce Lee, something shifted quietly in Chuck Norris's life. Hollywood had seen him now, not as a performer trying to act like a fighter, but as a fighter who could be captured on film. Still, recognition did not arrive instantly. There were no major studios waiting at his door, no guaranteed path into stardom. What followed was a slow, uncertain climb through low-budget productions and action films that most critics initially overlooked. But Chuck approached it the same way he approached everything else in his life, with discipline. His first lead roles were modest. Films like Breaker didn't make him a household name overnight, but they did something more important. They introduced a new kind of presence to audiences. A man who didn't overact, didn't overtalk, didn't try to force charisma. He simply existed on screen with control, stillness, and quiet authority. And that stood out, because in an era of louder personalities, Chuck Norris felt different. Grounded, real, almost minimal in expression, but powerful in impact. Then came the turning point films. Good Guys Were Black, A Force of One, The Octagon, each one refining the same image further. The lone fighter, the disciplined man, the silent force who acted when others hesitated. And with every role, his reputation grew stronger, not just as an action star, but as a symbol of a certain kind of cinematic identity. At the same time, behind the scenes, Hollywood was beginning to understand something important. This was not a temporary figure. This was someone audiences trusted, someone who didn't need to be reinvented to stay relevant. And that realization would soon lead him into the most defining era of his entire career. By the early 1980s, Chuck Norris was no longer just another action actor trying to find his place in Hollywood. He had become a brand of certainty in an uncertain time. America was shifting. Confidence in institutions was unstable. The cultural mood was searching for something clear, something direct, something that didn't feel complicated or distant. And on screen, Chuck Norris delivered exactly that. Films like Missing in Action and The Delta Force didn't just entertain audiences, they resonated with them on a deeper level. His characters were not complicated anti-heroes or conflicted personalities. They were focused, disciplined, and absolute in purpose. A man on a mission. A man who did not hesitate. A man who did what others could not. And audiences responded, because in Chuck Norris, they saw a version of strength that felt grounded. Not exaggerated fantasy, but controlled capability. Behind the scenes, his work ethic became just as legendary as his roles. Rapid production schedules, intense physical demands, and a consistent output of films turned him into one of the most reliable action stars of the decade. But what made this era even more powerful was not just his success. It was the identity he was building without even trying. The lone warrior archetype, the silent protector, the man who steps forward when everyone else steps back. By this point, Chuck Norris was no longer just playing characters. He was defining a template that countless action films would later try to replicate. And yet, even at the height of global fame, something unusual was happening beneath the surface. He was not chasing celebrity in the way Hollywood expected. He was slowly preparing for something else entirely. A shift away from the noise and back towards something more personal, more grounded, and more permanent. By the early 1990s, Hollywood was changing again. The era of nonstop action films was starting to fade, and many of the biggest names were shifting toward new styles, new roles, and new directions. But Chuck Norris made a different choice. Instead of chasing trends, he stepped into something more stable, more grounded, and far more personal. Television. Walker, Texas Ranger premiered in 1993, and at first, few expected it to become what it did. Another action series, another role built around the same image he had carried for years. But it quickly became something larger, because Cordell Walker was not just a character. He was a continuation of everything Chuck Norris had represented up to that point. Discipline, clarity, justice without hesitation. Each episode followed a simple moral structure. Good and evil were clearly defined. Right action was direct, and justice in some form always arrived. For millions of viewers, especially in households across America, Walker became more than entertainment. He became familiarity, a weekly reminder of order in a world that often felt unpredictable. Behind the scenes, those who worked with Chuck often described something consistent about him. No ego, no chaos, no distance from the people around him. Just a calm, steady presence who treated everyone on set with respect, regardless of role or status. And as the show continued for years, running for hundreds of episodes, something became clear. This was no longer just a television success. It was a cultural anchor built around a man who had spent his entire life moving with discipline, both on screen and off it. But long before the world began calling him a symbol, Chuck Norris had already started building something that had nothing to do with fame. In 1990, he founded Kickstarter Kids, not as a publicity move, not as a career extension, but as a response to something he had understood deeply from his own life. Discipline changes direction. The program was simple in structure, but powerful in purpose. Martial arts training brought directly into schools, aimed at giving young people something many of them had never truly been offered before. Focus, respect, control, responsibility. In environments where chaos often felt normal, Kickstart Kids introduced structure. And for thousands of students, that structure became a turning point. Because what Chuck Norris learned in Korea, he was now passing forward. Not through speeches, not through appearances, but through consistent hands-on action. Teachers and coaches often describe the impact the same way. Students who once struggled with direction began to change. Not overnight, but gradually through repetition and accountability. And at the center of it was a man who never positioned himself above the work. He showed up, quietly, consistently, the same way he had done everything else in his life. Because for Chuck Norris, success was never just about what you achieve for yourself. It was about what you leave behind in others. Just when it seemed like Chuck Norris had already completed every chapter of fame, something unexpected happened. The internet arrived, and with it, a completely new kind of fame that had nothing to do with movies, studios, or television ratings. It started as a joke. Small, exaggerated statements about strength, invincibility, and impossible feats. Things like Chuck Norris not needing sleep, or time obeying him instead of the other way around. But what began as humor quickly turned into a global cultural wave. Chuck Norris facts spread across forums, early social media platforms, and internet communities at a speed few memes of that era could match. And the most unusual part was this. It did not damage his image. It expanded it. Because unlike many public figures who struggle with internet parody, Chuck Norris became something different in digital culture. A symbol that existed between myth and reality. People who had never watched his films still knew his name, still understood the image, still recognized the tone of respect hidden inside the exaggeration. And quietly, Chuck himself responded with something rare in modern celebrity culture. He did not fight it. He accepted it with humor and calm detachment, turning what could have been distortion into one of the most unique second waves of fame in entertainment history. As time moved forward, Chuck Norris began to step away from the center of Hollywood life. Not in a dramatic exit, not in a public breakdown or controversy, but in a gradual shift that reflected something deeper. Choice. He had already lived through the highest levels of fame, success, and recognition. And at a certain point, the pace of that world no longer defined his daily life. Instead, he began focusing more on personal priorities, family, health, and structured purpose outside of entertainment. Occasional appearances still came. Interviews, guest roles, and public events kept his presence alive. But the constant cycle of production slowed down significantly. What remained consistent was his image. Even without frequent screen time, his identity in public culture stayed strong. The foundation he had built over decades did not fade when he stepped back, because his career was not built on short-term attention. It was built on long-term recognition. And in many ways, stepping back only reinforced the idea that he was never dependent on constant visibility to remain relevant. He had already crossed that threshold years earlier. So instead of chasing the next role, he began living a quieter version of the life he had already earned. Away from the screen, Chuck Norris became increasingly associated with something the public rarely sees in action stars at his level: stability. He focused on family life, personal discipline, and maintaining a routine that was far removed from the chaos often linked with Hollywood careers. In interviews, he often reflected on values that had shaped his entire journey: respect, humility, consistency, and the importance of structure in both success and personal growth. What made his perspective stand out was not complexity, but simplicity. He did not frame his life as a series of dramatic highs and lows. Instead, he emphasized steady progression and responsibility over time. For many people, this was unexpected, because the image on screen had always been associated with intensity and action. But the person behind that image carried a different tone: measured, calm, grounded. And as the years passed, that contrast became part of his broader legacy, not just as a performer, but as someone who embodied a balance between physical discipline and personal restraint. He was no longer just remembered for what he did in films, but also for how he chose to live when the cameras were no longer the center of his world. Over time, Chuck Norris's influence extended far beyond his own filmography. New generations discovered him in different ways, some through movies, some through television reruns, some through internet culture, and others through reputation alone. But across all of these entry points, the same pattern appeared: recognition of a specific archetype, the disciplined fighter, the silent authority figure, the character who represents control in moments of chaos. This archetype became embedded in action storytelling across decades. From video games to modern films, echoes of his screen presence can still be seen in how heroes are written and portrayed. Not because others copied him directly, but because he helped define a visual language for strength and restraint. At the same time, his off-screen contributions through programs like Kickstart Kids continued shaping lives quietly in the background, meaning his impact was not limited to entertainment. It extended into education and personal development for many young people. And that combination is what solidified his legacy. Not just fame, not just roles, but influence that continued operating long after peak visibility had passed. Looking at Chuck Norris's journey as a whole, it becomes clear that his story was never just about one phase of life. It was about progression, from a quiet childhood to military service, to martial arts mastery, to global entertainment recognition, and finally into cultural symbolism that outlived any single era of his career. Each stage built on the last without erasing it. And that is what makes his story stand apart. Because in a world where fame is often temporary, his presence became something more enduring. A reference point, a character in global culture that continues to be recognized even by those who have never watched his earliest films. But beneath all of that, the core remains consistent. Discipline, repetition, control, purpose. These are not just themes in his movies. They were the structure of his life. And that is why his name continues to circulate through generations in different forms, whether in cinema, conversation, or internet culture. Not as a moment in time, but as a lasting symbol of a certain kind of strength that never fully disappears.